Welcome to Early Childhood and the Bible, where I empower Christian parents to reclaim their God-given role as primary spiritual leaders and educators of their children. I'm Ann Livingston, an early childhood educator of over 20 years and a lover of Jesus and His Word. And I'm here to come alongside you with biblical encouragement and practical tools so you can lead your children's hearts, minds, and spirits with confidence. In a world that's pulling hard for your child's attention, you have been entrusted by God to shape their faith, their values, and their worldview. Here you'll find simple ways to weave discipleship into your everyday life, model a vibrant walk with Jesus, and guide your children into their own relationship with Him. You don't need a degree, a perfect home, or all the answers, just a willing heart and the Word of God. Let's take back the role God has entrusted to you and raise up the next generation to love Him and live for Him. Hey there. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about learning styles and just what I have noticed in my years of teaching, but also what I notice with the students who I tutor. And this is, I would say, more primarily for those of you who have children in public schools. I mean, obviously this is important if you're teaching your own children too, but I think that it's important for parents to have a little bit of information to help you kind of discern and decipher through the test scores, like the assessment scores that you're getting back from your child's teacher. And hopefully this will put you a little bit at ease if you have children who are not necessarily doing well with certain types of assessments. So before I launch into the different types of learning styles, I want to just kind of give some examples of how I have seen this play out with the students that I tutor. So this past week, I was tutoring a little girl who is in first grade, and she's a strong reader. She is above grade level in reading. She comprehends what she reads. Again, she's strong. She's a strong reader. And she loves to read. So her parents gave me, teachers send home like the packets of either like the homework or the different tests or whatever that they've done. So the parents gave me this packet full of stuff that had been sent home by her teacher. And one of the things in the packet was supposed to be like a reading comprehension test. And, her parents have said to me, that's like one main thing they want me to work on is reading comprehension. And so I look at this test and there's no story, there's no paragraph or, anything that she's read that I can see. And then there were a bunch of questions and she had gotten a 3 out of 10 on it. And so I always try, and I understand, when you're getting information from a child, you kind of have to take something with a grain of salt. You may or may not be getting the total truth, but I try to, and I also try to ask questions that aren't necessarily in like a leading type of way. I usually can pick up pretty quickly on what's going on, but I also want to try to ask a variety of questions so that I'm getting the full picture and not just, what I think is going on, which can also be hard sometimes. But anyway, so I asked this little girl, what happened? And she didn't really know how to answer that question. I don't think she really understood what it was that I was asking her. So then I asked her, did you have the story in front of you? And she said no. So then I asked to help clarify, was your teacher reading the story? And she said yes. And I said, so your teacher was reading the story, but you didn't have it in front of you? And she said, yeah. And so then I asked her what happened. And then I gave her some options. Because again, I was trying not to make an assumption and lead her into a specific answer. So I asked her, was it that your teacher read the story and you didn't hear her? Or did she read the story and you didn't understand what she was reading to you? Or did she read the story, but when she was done, you couldn't remember? And she said, I couldn't remember. And I said, okay. And so then I just kind of asked to clarify again. Okay, so what you're telling me is your teacher read the story. You didn't have the story in front of you. You were listening while she read, but you couldn't remember what she read after she read it. And the little girl said, yeah. So then I asked, and I kind of already knew the answer because again, I work with this student on a regular basis. But I asked her, does it feel easier to you when the story is in front of you, like when you can read it yourself? And she said yes. And I asked, do you think you have an easier time remembering what you've read when the story is in front of you? And she said yes. So, my initial thought is, okay, well, she's not an auditory learner. And I understand because I'm not either. I really struggle with auditory stuff. And now, granted, like I was reading up on a few things before recording this podcast, and some people believe that learning styles don't really matter at all. I fully disagree with that. I think learning styles do matter. Some people say learning styles matter, but you shouldn't only teach to one specific learning style. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that you kind of have like your dominant learning style. I do think that you can strengthen other ways of learning, but I also fully believe that we all have dominant learning styles, right? And and so although for sure there's benefits to kind of teaching across the board and again strengthening maybe some of your weaker learning styles, I think especially with young children, like that, okay, that's fine for adults. But for young children, I think teachers, and I put myself in that same category, although I don't have, a classroom anymore that I'm teaching. But I think that we as teachers, and then you as parents, because you also are teaching your children, need to be aware of how your child learns best and then help explain, especially new material. When you're teaching a new concept, especially if something is a little more abstract, you're going to want to teach it in what is their primary, more dominant learning style, because you're going to lower the frustration for them if you do it in that way. So I just explained to her parents. I said, this is what happened. This is why she got what she got. And so, so then what I do as her tutor is I also try to assess and see kind of where the gap is, where is the need. I see it as kind of like, problem solving, and it's almost like detective work for me, right? Like where is the gap that needs to be filled in? If I can pinpoint where that is, then we just strengthen that, and then that seems to help everything else. So, when she and I were working on reading comprehension, we read a book, and she, for the most part, she understood it. I mean, she understood what she read. I asked her questions, and for the most part, she was able to answer the majority of the questions. There were a few that she had to kind of go back into the text. But the other thing that I notice about her is she uses pictures as clues. And a visual learner is going to do that. But again, that is very common in early childhood. It's very common when children are learning how to read. Before they actually learn to read the words, they learn to read the pictures. So it makes a lot of sense that a lot of students are going to be pretty strong visual learners. And then when it comes to math, I would say the majority of young children are going to be kinesthetic learners, so hands-on learning when it comes to math. They need manipulatives. There are many math concepts that are very abstract. And again, I try to explain this to the parents that if they're just seeing a picture of something on a worksheet, for sure they can work with that diagram or whatever to be able to, especially like if it's adding and subtracting, okay, well they can draw or they can cross out, like, that's fine. But there's also something to be said for the hands-on learning using math manipulatives. And I have found that for the majority of my students, when they struggle specifically with a math concept, all I have to do is pull out the math manipulatives. And it can be something so basic. I think I shared this it was either one of the podcasts or one of my videos, that I have a container full of erasers, just the erasers that you pop on the end of pencils, that are super, super, super cheap. I think I maybe got them for like, I don't know, $1, $2 tops. And I've had them for years. And that's what I use for math manipulatives, to keep them in my tutoring bag. And as soon as a child has a hard time with something, I just, pull out the erasers and we work through it. And sometimes it's something super basic too, just like, instead of using a worksheet, I give them a dry erase board. It can be something really simple. Anyway, so then I had another student who his grandma said that he had scored low on math problems, like word problems. And so I was asking the student, again, trying to get an understanding of what was going on in the classroom. How was this actually being assessed? And I learned that he was given the worksheet. The teacher didn't read the word problems to him, and then he had to solve the problem. And he's in second grade. And I would say he is still, like, he's a pretty solid reader, but he needs some help with some of it. And I would say in general, he's probably stronger in math than he is in reading. And so when you have a word problem with a young child, especially a young child that is still learning how to read, you're no longer just assessing math. You're assessing actual reading, you're assessing reading comprehension, and then they have to translate what they have comprehended in order to do the math problem. And by the time you get into second grade, a lot of the math problems are multi-step math problems. That is a lot for a little brain to process. And it's not that it can't be done. It absolutely can be done. And when I work with my student one-on-one and we go through the process, he's able to do it, with some support. And then it's like, once we do a couple of them, then, he's off and running. He knows how to do it. But starting out, it feels intimidating to him to have a paragraph in front of him to have to read and comprehend, and then, translate that skill into a multi-step math problem. So that's what I was explaining to the grandma. I said, it's not that he doesn't know how to do it. It's that you have to look at what is the actual skill that's being assessed. I think I've maybe said this in one of the other podcasts too, like, there are a lot of assessments where it's just reading the problem and they have to listen, and they don't necessarily have the problem in front of them, and then they have to listen and choose the right answer. Well, in many cases, that then turns into a listening assessment. And I remember learning this in college. I don't remember exactly what class I was in, but I do remember in one of my education classes when we had to create assessments. And one thing that our professor hammered home was, you have to make sure that you are assessing accurately what you're wanting to assess. And what I'm finding, and I saw this when I was a teacher too, what I'm finding is that so many of the assessments, they're not assessing what they think they're assessing. And so that's, again, it's one area where I try to educate parents, because it doesn't mean that the parents will necessarily be able to, change. I mean, parents can't change the assessment. And a lot of times parents can't change, like how a teacher is teaching in the classroom. But at least it gives parents enough understanding so that, like, I think it makes things a little less overwhelming. It's like if you get an assessment, some sort of test that gets sent home, and you see that your child has failed it, well, of course, that's going to bring up concerns. But if you understand that it's usually that what they think they're assessing, they're not really assessing, then it kind of helps to give a greater understanding, to what's going on. So I just wanted to give kind of a little breakdown of some of these different learning styles. And I got this actually from Missouri State Education because I liked how it was broken down so well. But so visual learners use visual objects, so like graphs, charts, pictures, just actually seeing the information. Visual learners are also able to memorize and recall various information, and they tend to remember things that are written down. And then they learn better when they actually see what's being taught. So like this says, learns better in lectures by watching them. Well, that doesn't necessarily apply to early childhood, but it would in the fact that like seeing the teacher teach versus just hearing what the teacher is teaching and not actually seeing the teacher. But so I'm a visual learner, and I notice in my own learning style that when I'm memorizing something, especially if it's coming from a book, I wouldn't say, like, I don't think I have photographic memory, but it's almost like my brain takes a snapshot. So I can even remember, like if I'm needing to reference back to something in a book, I can typically go back to exactly where it is in the book because I can visualize in my mind where it was when I saw it. But I've also had moments where, like I said, it's almost like my brain takes like a snapshot of something. And so if I'm needing to recall that information again, it's like the snapshot comes up in my mind and I'm able to recall that. I don't know if that's every single visual learner, but it's a strategy that I've learned. And so now I use it on a pretty regular basis, and it comes in handy. But it's even the same thing like when I'm driving, there's a lot that is done through visual cues. If someone is telling me how to do something, I need them to show me. And if someone just tells me how to do something, I'm forgetting the directions almost immediately. I need to see it, and then I also need to do it, which goes into kinesthetic learning. But so visual learners. And then auditory learners, they retain information through hearing or speaking. And then they often prefer to be told how to do things and then repeat back. So that is something. Now, even if your child, like let's say they are a visual learner or they're a kinesthetic learner, but you're wanting to help strengthen their auditory learning skills, and I do this typically with children anyway. You may also find this just in parenting. Maybe you say, go put your shoes on, grab your backpack, and then meet me at the front door. Well, that's multi-step directions. And depending on the age of your child, sometimes that's really hard for them to do. You may find this where you're like, oh my gosh, all they did was they put their shoes on, but they forgot their backpack, and then they were wandering around, and you're like getting really frustrated. Well, that's because they probably only heard go put your shoes on. After they heard go put your shoes on, they tuned out from everything else. All they heard was go put your shoes on. So if you're wanting to strengthen this in your child, you tell them, so go put your shoes on, go grab your backpack, and then meet me at the front door. And then you say to them, okay, now repeat back to me what you heard. And then let's say maybe they say, go put my shoes on. Yes, but what else? And then they don't remember, right? So you will probably have to repeat things, but the more that you say something and then they know that they have to repeat it back to you, the more focused they're going to be on what it is that you're saying to them. So I'm not an auditory learner. It is my weakest learning style. But if I know that I am going to have to repeat something back to someone, then I listen much more. But here's a real life example, right? Someone is introducing themselves to me, right? They shake my hand, they tell me what their name is, and within 0.2 seconds, I have completely forgotten what their name is. Like, I don't even know. Often I'll ask, it's like, oh, I'm Anne, what's your name? And then they'll tell me. And it's like, I don't even know why I asked, because again, in like 0.2 seconds, I have completely forgotten what their name is. So again, real life examples of struggle. However, if someone was introducing themselves to me, they say, "Hi, my name is Jane," and they're wearing a name tag, I'm a visual learner. So I see Jane, and then they tell me their name is Jane, but of course, even if they didn't, I would see it, and then I would remember what their name was. So as a teacher, I always had name tags for my students, and I typically would memorize their seating chart, and I was able to learn my students' names pretty quickly because I always had that visual support. Okay. Auditory learners, well, so this says that they often have talents in music, which I do have a talent in music, but again, it's my weakest learning style. But it says they may concentrate better with soft music playing in the background. I do work well with music playing in the background, and I can typically focus pretty well with it. But again, auditory learning is not my strength. Then you have kinesthetic learning style. So they prefer to use a hands-on approach to learn new material, and they would rather demonstrate how to do something rather than verbally explain it. And it's the same thing. They would also rather have something demonstrated. And then it's like once something is demonstrated, they want to try it. So this is another strength of mine where someone shows it to me because I'm a visual learner. And then once I'm able to do it, and now I may not get it the first time, I may not even necessarily get it the second time, but as I'm doing it, I get stronger and stronger. But if someone is just telling me and then I have to sit down and do it, I'm lost. So see it first and then do it. This shows up in a teaching style called I do, we do, you do. So as a teacher, I do, so the students would see it. So that's visual, right? They see me do it, and then we do it together, and then the student does it on their own, and it incorporates the visual and the kinesthetic learning. So here's how you can support some of these different learning styles. So for a visual learner, using pictures, flashcards, different types of charts. If you're working on like reading comprehension, if you have sequencing cards, that would be helpful. That would be visual and kinesthetic because it's a hands-on activity with the visual. You can color code certain things, and then like I said, using different flashcards. For auditory learning, anything that can be recorded and listened to. Now, if you wanted to combine auditory and visual, one thing that I used to do in my classroom was I had different listening centers for books. So I had a bunch of books on tape. Of course, the technology would be different now, but I had books on tape and probably even books on CD at some point. And then the students would have the book and they would be listening and they would be following along in the book while they're listening. So that combines the visual and the auditory. Learning is strengthened when you incorporate multiple learning styles together. Another way to help auditory learners is by having a discussion, right? Having a discussion about what was read, and then having some sort of background music while studying. It's better if the music is instrumental, because when you have music with words, it can distract, obviously. And then for kinesthetic learners, you may notice that kinesthetic learners need to move. They need to take breaks often. We see this, it's very common with boys, right? With young boys. Obviously, girls can be active too, but I see this primarily with boys. Boys have a hard time sitting still. And unfortunately, we have geared our school, our educational system is really geared towards girls. And so then boys move around a lot, and then they get in trouble, and then eventually they typically get medicated for just simply being boys. So if you know that you have a child who's a kinesthetic learner, it's important to give them breaks often. Also, teaching through movement. So I've done different spelling activities using their body. So for instance, raising your arms up for the tall letters. So like D, for instance, would be a tall letter. Putting your hands on your hip for a middle letter, like O, and then putting your hands down by your knees for a low letter, so letters that are below the line, so like G, right? So if you were spelling dog, it would be arms up, arms on the waist, arms up, hands on the waist, hands on the knees. D, O, G. So they're moving their body as they're spelling it out. That's really helpful for kinesthetic learners. And then working while standing. So one of my little boys, I always give him a choice. You can stand, you can sit. It's up to you, but I have boundaries, right? So he can't, I think I've said this before, he can't lie across the chair. He can't lie on the floor. But if he needs to stand so he can move his body, that by all means, that's fine with me. Would that necessarily work in a whole classroom? Depends. It depends on the teacher. It depends on the students. It just depends. And then any type of like real life experience, so like going on field trips and learning, would be really good for a kinesthetic learner. So those are the three main learning styles. It looks as though nowadays they have expanded, and I didn't do much research into, I saw a bunch of pages that were about 7 learning styles. I didn't look into that. I think as long as you have the 3 main learning styles, that's pretty much all you need to know. But so I hope this is helpful. Again, if you're, I assume you're a parent if you're listening to this podcast, but whether you're homeschooling or your child is in public education, or even, a charter school or private school, but some sort of classroom setting, it's helpful if you know how your child learns. It's helpful if you have an understanding of, how the teacher teaches. If the teacher is able to incorporate a variety of different learning styles, you're going to find that your student's going to be much more successful with this. But and then if you're homeschooling, then if you can, kind of observe your child and see what you notice as far as when you're teaching, and then, like I said, gear it towards their stronger learning style, but you're going to get the best success if you incorporate a variety of learning styles. So I hope this was helpful. Comment below, leave a review, share this with another parent who you think this may be helpful for. Share it with your child's teacher if you're not sure if your child's teacher is even aware of this. I love this stuff. I just love being able to support students and families, and really to help for the success of the child. So God bless you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next week. If this episode blessed you, please subscribe, comment, and share it with another parent who is trying to raise godly children in an ungodly world.